Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for a discussion about career paths for fine art photographers. My name is Connor Risch. I'm a member of the Photo Plus staff, and I'm also the editor of the 30, which for those of you who don't know, is an annual program that celebrates the work of early career photographers. The two photographers with us today, Danielle Bowman and Eli Durst, are part of the 2020 edition of the 30. And I would encourage you to take a look at the gallery, which you can find at the30photographers.com. There are profiles and galleries of work by 30 early career photographers there. We pay special attention to how these photographers are building their careers in the different markets for photography that they work in. So there's a lot of great information there. And again, I would just encourage you to take a look at the gallery if you hadn't had a chance to do that. I'm really excited to have these two photographers here to speak about their career paths as artists and also to share some of their brilliant work. In addition to being, fantastic photographers with really conceptually interesting fine artwork. Danielle and Eli are both university professors who teach photography, so this should be a fantastic chance to learn from them. Just to talk a little bit about how the program's going to go, as we put together the profiles of the 30 this year, one of the things we, as I said, we focused on is how each photographer figured out which opportunities they pursued as they were finding their career paths early on. And one thing that came up in conversation quite a few times is this practice of looking at other photographers' CVs to see what propelled the careers of people whose work they admired or what have you. So in that spirit, I asked Danielle and Eli to talk through a few of the things on their CVs to give you all kind of a live version of that process of researching what other folks have done. So that will be part of the conversation today. They'll also be talking through some of their work, which is fantastic. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I will try to interject those where appropriate. We are also going to leave some time for a general discussion at the end, so you can also hold your questions for that. We are going to look through the work that they've shared with us in alphabetical order. So Danielle, we're going to start with you. Maybe if you could just, do a brief introduction, who you are and where you're at, where you're from, and then we can get into the work.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Danielle Bowman. I am from Los Angeles, California, but I have lived in New York since 2007. In Brooklyn. And like Connor said, I am a practicing artist who works in photography, and I teach photography. I've taught at Parsons, Wesleyan. I'm teaching at the University of Hartford and a couple other schools. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Great, thank you. And Danielle, just let me know, you can sort of yell slide like a boss if you want, and I'll advance the slides here.
Okay, cool. All right, so I won't bore people with too much info, but just to get a brief overview, because I also know that what's in this presentation is like a little bit of the three biggest things I've done in the past few years. So this image, and probably the first few images, is actually made in grad school. That project is called Here Now. And the thing that really got that work going was that I, like many people who have been in grad school of any discipline, learn it's kind of a burn it down and build it back up again mentality. And I was in this space where I was like burning it down, but like needing to learn how to build it back up. And I went to Yale for grad school, and I was in the Yale University Art Gallery, and they happened to have some old Timothy O'Sullivan and Carlton Watkins prints. And I had seen them before, but never really considered them seriously as formal objects or conceptual objects until that moment. And so I started researching them, and I discovered the true purpose of those photos as government propaganda. I'm sure there's some photo historians in the audience, so feel free to correct me because I'm not a historian, I'm an artist. But I just didn't know that O'Sullivan and Watkins had been commissioned by the United States government to accompany geological land surveys and military land surveys of the Western territories in the late 19th century, I think. And so the idea that these two men were commissioned to make these images that wound up, you know, inspiring the government to make decisions about these places that we still kind of hold, that was really interesting to me. So that all of that thinking turned into making work that was about questions of who gets to decide what views and perspectives and images of things are important, and how those ideas are established and maintained, and as well as a general critique of what becomes historicized and what doesn't. And so that manifested in me photographing landscapes of historical significance and then photographing objects in museums like this one. And I think this picture directly speaks to this idea of the upkeep of histories that are maybe not relevant, or histories that you never even question sort of why you're tending to them in the first place. Next slide, please. So this is all just work from that project. Formally, in addition to photographing landscapes and objects, that manifested in very contrasty dark images. And that was just a visual way for me to refer to the aspects of history that are left to fall into darkness and obscurity versus moments in history that are held into the light. Next slide. Another formal interest of this work was in looking at land and landscape as material for the monuments I was critiquing. So there's a lot happening with that work. There's like the connection of land and earth materials to monuments, the connection of landscape to what winds up in museums, and then the sort of connection back to being inspired by those old photographs of the Western United States. Next slide. So again, with this image, I was literally trying to obscure the bust of this person in this museum. Next slide. A photograph of a landscape. I became really interested also with this work in sort of turning the formalism of Watkins and O'Sullivan, and then later people like Ansel Adams on its head, and photographing landscapes in a way that was the opposite of photographing landscapes in a way that made them more disorienting, as opposed to making us as a viewer or me as a photographer feel like I know everything there is to know about a place just by photographing it from a certain point of view. Next slide. Another sort of disorientation or abstraction of a landscape. That's a mine in Arizona somewhere, I think outside of Phoenix. Next slide. And that's a photograph of the inside of the Yale University Art Gallery, which has great light. Next slide. So doing that project, the previous project, it was a really great kind of a breakthrough. I don't know, I kind of hate that word, but it was a breakthrough for me in terms of like connecting an interest in history that I've always had to my photographic practice, to my art practice. But I had a lot of problems with that work after I made it. Like, I thought my general sort of institutional critique was too vague. I was concerned that the sort of formal qualities, the darkness and the contrast I was leaning on them a little too heavily in moments where maybe I didn't feel like I could have enough conceptual specificity. So learning from the sort of things that I hate about that previous work, I was able to figure out what I wanted to do next. And that project was called What Had Happened. And I showed that work at the Baxter Street Camera Club of New York last January, and that work also won the Aperture Portfolio Prize this year. And actually this coming January at the Portfolio Prize show, I will be showing some work from this project with some new work for this project that I've made over the past few months. So if you're in New York, stop by Baxter Street in January. But with this project, I wanted to focus on a more specific history and a history that was more personally important to me. After working on something that was so big and just a general critique of history, it felt really important for me to make it specific and personal in a way that wasn't necessarily autobiographical. I do think there's a big difference between the personal and the autobiographical. And I think you can have work that is inspired by your personal history without it necessarily being an autobiography. So this work is focused on, well, is inspired by the Great Migration, and I can get into that in a little bit. Maybe we should just go to the next slide. I made this work in Los Angeles around Baldwin Hills, Inglewood, and Crenshaw. And anyone in the audience who is from LA or lives in LA will know that those are historically Black neighborhoods, and they have been since the 1960s, just about. I grew up in Baldwin Hills. I grew up on the west side of LA broadly, but specifically in Baldwin Hills. And I wanted to make images that worked from my acknowledged experience of growing up there, instead of hiding behind like bigger histories. And I wanted to focus on those neighborhoods and the homes of the people in those neighborhoods as their own kinds of museums, institutions in their own right for molding those living there, kids growing up there as I did. So next slide. Mm-hmm. The photos, thank you. The photos were made in the homes of family, friends, family, and total strangers whom I scouted for the project. Again, I just think it's really important to know, because I have been misquoted in interviews. This is not about my family. The point of this project is that it has been really interesting to me to visually link the homes of older Black people and to see all of the moments where I feel like I can connect and I feel like I belong, even in the home of someone that I don't know. So it's really important to know that this project is not all people that I know. Some of these people I didn't know. Next slide. And the criteria for how I picked the homes and the people that I photographed, I wanted to focus on Black baby boomers who had moved to LA during the Great Migration, and had lived where they lived in their home or apartment or wherever for a significant amount of time, just so that the space felt like, like I said, a kind of museum for them and their history. And again, this project is really not about the Great Migration. I'm not making a documentary project about families of people who migrated. It's really more about finding the poetic connections amongst people who made similar big decisions in the migration and settled. And yeah, it's really just about the visual connections in the homes and amongst the people and amongst a culture. I guess next slide. So this is an abstraction of Los Angeles. This is my kind of a landscape. I think it's a lot more interesting to speak to a place, the specificity of a place in this kind of a way, this kind of a picture that has a lot more of a visceral quality than maybe necessarily making a photograph of a Hollywood sign, right? Like this picture is about LA to me because those cracks in the sidewalk they represent the fact that there's earthquakes in LA. In order for there to be cracks in the sidewalk, the ground has to shift underneath it. But I also think they look like tributaries, and they sort of remind me of, the ideas of different people sort of coming together and splitting apart and crossing paths and that kind of thing. Next slide. This is a woman in her backyard in Hills. This is probably one of my favorite pictures from this, just because I have a really deep connection to that hairdo, because it reminds me of like my mom and my grandma and like my aunties. So this is a special picture. Next slide. I like to use repetition in the work because I feel like it's just shorthand to talk about time, to repeat scenes and images, just a really quick way to point to time overlapping and being cyclical as opposed to being linear, which I think is something that I like to think about. Next slide. Another kind of landscape or an abstraction of landscape in LA. It's a picture of the ground. I guess I should also say all of these images are 4x5, so the detail is really, really nice. Next slide. multiple exposure of plants in my mom's front yard. So another sort of a version of a landscape image. Next slide. Another landscape, a backyard in Inglewood. This is another image. I'm not sure if both are in this presentation, but this exists as a pair. There's another photo of the same backyard without the shadow. And in addition to the two images sort of speaking to the cyclical nature of time and the passing of time, I think the shadows turn the backyard into a sundial. And then if you look in the upper left area, there's an airplane overhead, which speaks to migration, obviously, but I think also just speaks to this idea of time travel and travel. Next slide. That's the sister image. Next slide. And this image actually was one of the rare occasions that I know exactly what I want to do before I do it. That doesn't happen to me a lot. The way that I work is I like for there to be loose parameters so that I'm not sort of out to sea, but I have enough wiggle room to experiment and try things. But with this image, I kind of knew exactly, I wanted a screen door picture and I wanted to have that effect that screen doors have on the world, where if you're inside looking outside and it's daytime, the screen door kind of renders the world as a halftone. So I wanted to have that as an image. So that's what this picture is. Next slide. And kind of a portrait. Part of the reason it's so important to me with this work that I'm clear about the fact that it's not documentary, even though it borrows documentary aesthetic, is that, again, it's not about one family, it's not about one person, it's not about one story. That's also why you don't see any, I guess, traditional portraits in the work, because I don't want people to get caught up in thinking that I'm trying to, I don't know, reveal some family history. It's really not meant to be documentary, it's poetic. Next slide. So in 2019, I worked on the 1619 project, which was an amazing experience. I traveled around the southeastern United States. This photo was made in Virginia. And I think I was assigned this work because Kathy Ryan and Jessica Dimson of New York Times had seen my grad school work, and they knew that thinking about history and thinking about what histories are privileged over others was something that's really important to my practice, and something that I'm really focused on. And so that the assignment really fit me because I was charged with photographing landscapes, pretty banal, everyday landscapes that people pass by without thinking twice about, landscapes where there had been slave sales and slave auctions. Next slide. So this is the full image without the text. Next slide. This is a photograph of a field, kind of industrial area outside of Savannah, Georgia, where the largest sale of enslaved people took place in the history of this country. It's called the Weeping Time sale. Even contemporaneously, like when the sale was happening, the people sold in that sale referred to it as the Weeping Time sale. Next slide. That is Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's plantation. Some of these images were not published. What wound up being published was that cover image and then a portfolio of about 13 images. This one was not one of them, but I like it. So next slide. A detail of a column from Monticello. The columns were, of course, made by Thomas Jefferson's enslaved people. Next slide. That is very dark. But it's a, no, it's okay. It's a dark, it's meant to be dark. It's a dark picture, but I also had the little window small, so it seemed extra dark. So that is New Orleans. And I think it is Royal Street between, gosh, I can't remember. It's right by the Omni Royal Orleans, if anyone knows where that is. And that hotel, it's like an Omni hotel that you can stay in like tonight if you want. In that hotel, there was a very, very, very large slave, there was a large market, and they would sell slaves in addition to coffee, sugar, whatever. And that street is between the river and the hotel, and so the slaves would come in on a boat and then be walked from the river to the boat, or from the boat to the space. It wasn't a hotel at the time. It was just like a space. I don't know. I don't remember. Next slide. That is in New Jersey. That power plant sits on the site of, I think, a slave jail, so like a holding pen. There was a man in New Jersey, I can't remember his name right now, but I'm sure I have the notes of it, who would trick freed people into slavery by telling them if they were looking for work. He would say, well, I know of work, and would abduct them and send them down south. And before he sent them, he would keep them in a holding pen on this site. Next slide. And I think that is the start of the slave trail in Richmond, Virginia. The city of Richmond has a trail mapped out that you can walk, which I guess is supposed to be the trail that the slaves were forced to walk from the James River to the downtown area of Richmond, which was a huge slave trading active place. Next slide. And that is a view of the James River from, I can't remember which bridge, but it was a bridge that slaves were made to walk across on their way down to downtown Richmond. All of the information and research for this work was done by the historian Anne C. Bailey, and she actually wrote a book on the Weeping Time, if anyone is interested. She's a really brilliant historian. Next slide.
I think that's it.
Oh, great. Well, that's it.
Well, before we move on to Eli's work, I just, and since we were just talking about the New York Times Magazine work, would you tell us a little bit about how, like, did Kathy and Jessica track your work down, like, on the internet? Like, did you present it to them? And I'm just kind of curious about how that project came together.
Sure. Yeah, I emailed in, I think, the fall of 2018. I cold emailed a handful of editors, and Kathy was one of them. And yeah, she said, thank you for your interest. And then, nothing really happened. And then that following summer, like July, like 8 or 9 months later, I was contacted by Jessica to ask if I would be interested to do this project. So that was pretty wonderful. I mean, I know it seems really, maybe it seems far-fetched to think that cold emails and things like that still work, but they definitely do. And I think if your work is strong, just because someone doesn't have something for you right away, doesn't mean they won't have something for you later on.
As a fine art photographer, well, I mean, you mentioned that they had a sense of your interests as an artist, and that your interests as an artist really matched up with the assignment as well. Did you get in, like, when you sent that cold email to them, did you get into, like, your interests as an artist in addition to sharing work? Or, like, what was I'm just always curious, like, as an artist approaching someone in the editorial space, like, how do you kind of talk about yourself and your work in a way that, like, helps them make the connection that, oh, this is someone who can go out and shoot something for us?
Yeah, I think I sent them like a PDF, and in the body of the email, I like sent, I don't know, you got to keep it short and sweet, right? But I also think it's important to give context.
Right.
So I probably sent like a couple sentences, like, I'm interested in history, like, I probably couldn't even do it. I'm so bad at the elevator pitch, but I'm better at writing. And then once I have it like written out, I'm like, oh, okay. But yeah, I definitely sent them a couple sentences what the work is about. I think that's really important. I think if I was to do it again now, I would probably, within a PDF, pack like a couple sentences so that they have no choice. Because if maybe they don't read the email, because they get so many of those emails every week, right? So maybe they don't read the email, but they download the PDF. That way, if you put what the work is about on a page in the PDF, like a keynote, then they see it right there. But I think that's very important. Like, don't assume people know what your work is about, because they probably don't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, thank you, Danielle.
Sure, thank you.
Eli, why don't you take it away here? And you can do the same. Just let me know when you're ready to go to the next slide.
All right, cool. Well, thank you for having me. It's awesome. It's awesome to see Danielle's work and look at it. It's so amazing. So I am a photographer. I work in the editorial sphere, fine art. I also attended Yale for grad school. I currently teach at the University of Texas in Austin, which is actually where I'm from originally. I guess you can go to the first slide.
Sure.
So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about like the different intersections, like where I work, right? Because I do think that like, I think, I don't know, I think this is a really interesting topic and it's really tricky. And it's like all photographers have to figure it out for themselves, right? Like, I think we all want like one path, like give me the path. But it's just not like that, you know, and everyone, you have to figure out like what you're good at and what you like, right? So I'm gonna try to talk about like certain fine art opportunities, teaching opportunities, editorial work. I also worked in retouching. So I've worked on the back end of that as well. I feel like I've kind of like tried to, you know, do everything. These first couple images are from a series I did called In Asmara, which won the 2016 Aperture Portfolio Prize. It's good to have another black and white Aperture Portfolio Prize winner. And I mean, it was an amazing opportunity. There was like a lot of visibility, right, for the work. It was a way to meet curators and collectors and photo editors. I think having shows is tricky because it can get, you know, expensive. But it is a great way to meet people. It's a great way to be like, hey, come to my show and I can talk to you about it, especially if you don't necessarily have a studio or if your studio is not maybe super manicured. So it was really, really valuable for me for that reason. These photographs are made in Asmara, which is the capital of Eritrea in Northeast Africa. I received a grant to make work that in some way revolved around human rights in the world. And so the Asmara is a really interesting, really singular, really fascinating place because it was almost entirely built out under Mussolini when it was an Italian colony. So I went there trying to kind of look at this, the legacy of post-colonialism and what it looked like. You'll see a lot of like kind of sort of Italian style things like espresso. You can go to the next slide, Connor.
Sure.
This is on the last day of Ramadan. But it's interesting looking at Danielle's work. It's like so much I feel like Danielle's work was like, what is visible, what is invisible in the landscape? You know, how do you show those things? How do you imply a certain interiority, a certain depth, a history, right, that you can't see? And I think this is related. It's almost like inverted. I need to think about this for a second, but it's like all of these things that were built that are the signs of this colonial empire and expansion and violence. But then that culture is gone, but like the buildings remain, right? So it's like a different, you know, it's Eritreans using these spaces and reclaiming these spaces. You can go to the next slide, Connor. It's extremely restrictive. The government is extremely oppressive. Very, very spotty internet connection. Internet is censored. Some call it the North Korea of Africa just because of the lack of access to a free press. Hopefully things are changing. But again, trying to sort of show that in the images. Next slide, please. This is the stadium with these Olympic rings, even though of course there would never be the Olympics there. So how do you stage power, right? How do you stage colonial power in that sort of sense? And then liberation, right? Because there's this like relief in the back that is the sign of the Eritrean independence movement. But I guess what I would say about applying to things, you can go to the next slide, Connor.
Sure.
This is my friend Hashem who showed me around. It's like, you just have to have a thick skin and you have to like be able to handle rejection. It's like, I get rejected from the majority of the things I still apply for. And it's like, you just can't take it personally and you can't let that be your validation or invalidate your work. You know, there's so many amazing artists out there making such different types of work. And it doesn't mean that someone's work is better than yours or your work isn't, you know, will never add up to anything, right? It's more about like finding the fit, you know, the curator, the space, the show, the group, right? Maybe it's a group show and it matters like who you're in dialogue with. So it's like, I just think I mean, I know obviously a lot of things are like have fees and stuff, but I just think you apply to stuff and apply to stuff, and you'll find the community, the people who get your work.
Mhm. How did you identify, and maybe Danielle, you can address this as well, since we're this is maybe a good point to do it. How did you identify the Aperture Portfolio Prize as something that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, well, for me, it's like, and the other thing I want to talk about was Red Hook Labs, which is another thing I applied for and was in 2018. Because for me, it's like I look at like what community do I want to be a part of, right? I look at past winners, the shows. Um, what is a group of photographers, of artists that I really want to be a part of? And for me, the Aperture Portfolio Prize was always that. Just amazing artists who I admired and I liked. And then with Red Hook Labs, it was so cool because it was like I loved the programming, the education, the energy, the enthusiasm, the events, and how diverse. Like I remember like the show I was in, like Tyler Mitchell was in that show. It was like, this intersection of fashion, which is like so different than what I was doing. But like, so that's how, I guess that's for me, it's like what work do I like? And I guess that goes to the point, Connor, of like looking at people's CVs.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like what community do I want to be a part of?
Danielle, is that fairly similar to your calculus as well when you're looking at different opportunities?
Yeah, I think if you can identify people that you admire, like Eli's saying, and kind of see what you can learn from the things that they've done. In terms of the portfolio prize, I think I just I just feel like I have always admired Aperture for the place that it is held, I think, within photography, contemporary photography, and just to be a part of the conversation by like participating in the portfolio prize. It just seemed like a really good way to be a part of that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Eli, can we keep going here with yours?
Let's go.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go. This is the dump outside of Asmara. This is as far as I could go without permission from the government. I had to sort of like keep them. I had to like basically be very aware of where I was going and also let them know if I was kind of leaving the city limits at all. And you can't really tell. There are two people and a dog in the background there. But all right, you can go to the next slide, Connor. I think I have some other. Oh yeah, so okay, this is. I want to talk about the editorial work for a second. Because editorial work is definitely something I was interested in. I'll talk about teaching in a bit, but it's like it was also something I really wanted to do, and I'm like Danielle, it's like I make pictures out in the world, so it seemed like a good fit. And so these are all images I did for one of my first like big editorial assignments. This was for the New York Times style section. I worked with editor Eve Lyons, who's amazing and commissions amazing work. And so these are I just give a little bit of background. These are photographs from Buc-ee's, which is like this insane gas station that's all over Texas, and they're expanding to like Alabama and Florida. But gas station is like totally undersells it. They call it like a retail space with petroleum products. It's enormous. It's like this, it's like the big ones, the mega stores are like, I mean, they're not as big as Walmart's, but they're like absolutely gigantic. They have hundreds and hundreds of pumps. They don't allow truckers. The idea is like this is like a family place where you spend time. They have merchandise. And it's all extremely connected to this idea of identity and Texas identity. Space and power and masculinity and consumerism, like above all else. This is they're also famous for barbecue. This is some barbecue. You can go to the next slide, Connor. I mean, you can kind of see here the scale of it. But this is the kind of thing where, like Danielle, I just did a bunch of cold emailing. I didn't hear back from most people, most editors once I finished grad school. And then when I did, I would take meetings with them. And sometimes the meetings were like awkward or painful. It's like transactional. It's like you want something, you feel very judged and you have to put yourself out there, right? And to risk like them not liking the work. And so it's like I had all these meetings, and I've never had a meeting where someone was like, okay, here's a job, right? I've like never had that. But the photo editors, there's like I mean, it's like they have so many stories, right? And their job is to find people who work with those stories, right? Whose vision aligns with those stories. And so I think it was kind of like what Danielle was saying. It was like, for me, it was like, 6 months later, I got a call. I was like, hey, we have this thing that you might be interested in. So, and that's kind of how it happened, right? And then I did a story, and then I was able to pitch some stories. And then other photo editors saw like, okay, this guy can do it. He's not, I had my doubts, but maybe he can do it. And so then, you kind of build that up slowly. You can go to the next slide. And, not all the assignments are as interesting to you but this was an example where it's like, I really wanted to photograph in Buc-ee's. But I wasn't able to get access without a credential. So this is the kind of thing I pitched it to Eve Lyons, and so it was like, because it, I think, aligned with what she was doing, and this idea of style more as like cultural movements, but also because it was what I wanted to be doing. I mean, this took a lot of time. I spent all day at like 6 different Buc-ee's locations across Texas, on the weekends. So I spent, probably at least 100 hours in these stores. So it's a lot of time, right? And so in general, it's like, I think it's good to find things that you like to be doing, right? Because I think that's going to make the work better. This is when the brisket's done. Everyone screams brisket, brisket on the board. But I think it aligns with my work. I think it aligns, and some of the work I'll show in a second. And that is why it was so appealing to me, because I could kind of fuse the editorial work and pictures that I wanted to make.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned too, being able to get credentialed to go in and essentially make work that you maybe wanted to make personally for yourself, but since you have the credential, you can get access, and that's a great way to use the editorial work.
Yeah. This is a sausage in a tortilla on a stick. But I mean, I could talk a lot about it, kind of what Danielle was saying about documentary, because I feel very similarly. Like, the language of documentary, it's piggybacking on the relationship, the privileged relationship documentary has to the idea of the truth or the reality, which of course it's not. But I guess the other thing I'll say is, like, when you're pitching things to editors, or when you're cold emailing, which I also did, I would say, like, you want to show them the breadth of what you can do, right? It's like, I would send some of my color work and some of my black and white work, but you want to show them who you are as a photographer, right? I don't think the idea is like, oh, I can do anything, I'm this chameleon, like, I'll do whatever you want, because I don't think that's really what I think they want to see. Like, what is your voice? What is your vision? And then, it's the photo editor's job to like find the stories that are going to work and that you're going to be able to show and reveal in a way that maybe another artist couldn't. So I think you want to show them the breadth of what you can do, but like, you still want to show your personality, right? And what you do.
Right.
All right, next slide, please. This is the jerky wall. They have hundreds and hundreds of varieties of beef jerky.
Amazing.
Shooting there was super fun because I just like ate things there. I just like got my coffee there. It was just like I could just live there. These are some girls on the way to a cheer competition. A lot of like buses like stop there, so like cheer competitions, football teams. So you'll see these huge influxes of like Boy Scouts and stuff like that. All right, next slide. Okay, this is more of my fine artwork. This is from my series called The Community, which was just published as a monograph in May by Morel Books. And I could get in. This is all sort of work that revolves around these like community centers, multi-purpose spaces, the idea of people looking for a certain community, various team building activities, new age spiritual practices, Boy Scouts. You go to the next slide, Connor. This is a new age class I photographed. But all these like kind of very charged, ambiguous things happening in this type of space. I guess for these images, I want to talk about teaching. I really enjoy teaching. I love engaging with photography, just like every day with students. And I mean, it is tricky. Like, it is a tricky sphere, right? There aren't that many opportunities. Adjuncting, which is where I started. I mean, it's like, you pay so little. It's so terrible. It's like so exploitative. But it did for me lead to a more permanent position at UT. You can go to the next slide, Connor.
Sure. Oh, sorry.
So I don't know, I mean, to me, it's like you have to figure out like what you want to do and what you like. And I did a lot of retouching and printing before I was teaching for other artists, for commercial, enterprises. And, I like that. I feel like I learned a lot. It helped with my own practice. But like staring at a screen for 8 hours a day, it just wasn't, I got through so many audiobooks, but it just like wasn't quite me. And I much preferred interacting with people. And anyway, so, but that being said, I went to grad school, people are amazing artists, and it's like, who have no interest in teaching, right? And it's like, so for them, it's like, I don't think it's like, oh, you got your MFA, then you like need to go, teach, or you have to teach by any means.
Right.
This is a bingo hall. You can go to the next slide, Connor. Boy Scouts. This is a community theater group. So these are photographs in Texas and Connecticut and New York. I mean, the beauty of working in these spaces is that they're ubiquitous and they're interchangeable, right? They're extremely functional. And same tables, same chairs, same carpets. But I liked how strange it became when you put one next to the other, right? Like how could meaning be created in between images? How could you take this like kind of traditionally documentary subject, but photograph it in a way and then sequence it in a way where hopefully it becomes weirder or stranger than the reality, right? Hopefully it becomes more than the sum of its parts. Thinking less about like, look at all these different groups, and more like, what are the commonalities here, right? Like, what is the connection between this group of people and then the Boy Scouts, right? In the previous image, like what are they after, and how is that connected in some way? You can go to the next. Is there another one? Or is it the last?
This is the last one.
Yeah. And this is one of the last images in my book. So yeah, I mean, I guess, it's tricky. I mean, and there are a lot of things you can do, as a photographer. Mm-hmm. I would say most of them aren't super lucrative in my experience. So it's not, it's not like I got an MFA, like, I'm rich.
Is it?
But
well,
I think
so
you have to do what you enjoy, I guess, it's like you have to find the things that you like doing, right, in photography.
Right. Well, so I want to get into sort of more of a discussion of some specific career paths thing, and I want to actually touch on the MFA, but we do have a question from Jeremy White, who's watching, and he's just asking about whether either of you have actually put on your own shows as a way to get your work out. Like mounting an exhibition on your own.
No. New York is expensive.
Right.
And I definitely know people. I knew more people who would do that in college. Mm-hmm. I went to Cooper Union for college, and so it makes it like people would have shows in their apartments, right? But like, I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I just don't know how realistic that is in New York City. In other places, it's probably a lot more possible. And maybe I'm just being very closed-minded, but also having shows, like, even if you can do it in a cheap way, it's still not going to be that cheap. And that is from like finding the space and renting the space to like printing the work. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize, or at least a lot of my students don't realize, that after school, unless they are wealthy, you don't have a printer. So are you going to pay someone to print your work? Because that costs money. Or are you going to figure out how to buy a printer? Because that costs money too. So the answer to that question is no. But I think outside of New York City, or even like in Yonkers, it's probably more possible than it is down here.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we definitely do want to get into some questions here, folks. If you have questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. I'll just start out though, and I wanted to go back to this issue of the MFA. How did you figure out that an MFA was the right path for you, and kind of what would you advise photographers who are considering pursuing an MFA?
Danielle, you want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
You go, because I did the last one.
Okay, I took 3 years in between undergrad and grad school, and I went to Wesleyan. So another shout out for Wesleyan. So it wasn't. I mean, I studied art. I was actually an American Studies major, but anyway, I didn't go to an art school. I knew I wanted to get an MFA, right? Because I felt like I kind of missed. I mean, I loved Wesleyan. I loved the education I got, but I felt like I did kind of miss out on a certain sort of like cohort or community of artists. And so for me, it was just like it was important to take time in between. I think the MFA is something where it's like it doesn't guarantee you anything, right? Like it's not like, oh, now I'm gonna become, get like a 200K, a year job, and so it doesn't guarantee you anything. So it's like I think you should go when you're ready, when you want to go, and I think you get what you put into it. You get out what you put into it, right? Like I think you could go to grad school and like phone it in and it would be fine, right? It's like it's not like your advisor is really gonna like take it personally. I mean they might, but it's not like undergrad. It's not like they're gonna hold your hand. So I just think you should go when you're ready, and like when you're like, and for me I spent 3 years. I was working at a fine art printing lab. I was assisting Joel Meyerowitz, street photographer. So I was like facilitating other people's work and learning from them, and I was just so ready to like make my own work. And I mean, I was making my own work, but like concentrate really on my own work. And so I was really, really craving that. So I feel like for me, I was ready and I knew it. But I don't, if you're like, should I, like, my parents want me to go to grad school, but I don't really know. Like, I don't think that's necessarily a good reason, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you just want to go to grad school, you should probably study like the law. Like if you're just going to grad school for fun, like go do something where you can be funded and get paid. Like, yeah, I really I'm the first, I'll be the first person to say, or not first person, but I have no problem with saying that MFAs are unnecessary for some people. Not everyone needs them. Like it's not like a golden ticket, and they cost money. And I think we're at this place with higher education where there needs to be a broader reckoning, at least in the United States, but specifically with MFA programs. There's a lot of them, and I don't think that anyone needs to have an MFA to, I don't know, do whatever it is they want to do. So the bigger question is, well, what do you want to do? And what do you think you need to get there? I needed an MFA, or I felt like I wanted to go to grad school, which I think is a different sensation than wanting an MFA, right? Because I'm wanting the experience and not necessarily the piece of paper that's like an extra bonus thing. But I took 5 years off between undergrad and grad. And in that time, I had stepped away from making work actually. And I felt like I really needed to reacquaint myself with my practice in a way that was a little bit removed from the world. And I also wanted to be in a situation that was a little more photo focused. Cooper Union is an amazing school, obviously. It's very interdisciplinary. At this point in my work, I'm definitely thinking more about interdisciplinary and leaning into other modalities of making. But by the time I went to grad school, I really wanted to be in a photo specific environment. So that was why I went. But I went to undergrad with plenty of people who are brilliant artists, none of whom have MFAs or have any desire to get one. So yeah.
That's great. Thanks for that. So a good question here from Gaspar Marquez. And it's, how do you fund your projects and gallery exhibitions? And that's a big question, I guess. The question, perhaps. But maybe Eli, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big one. I mean, I would say that's like I teach, I do editorial work. I mean, all those things I feel like, support me, allow me to make the work I want to make. I have received like some grants, like the Inez Mara work. I received a grant to travel there. But one that I remember, I was having like a studio visit in grad school and talking about like, oh, if I get a grant, I could do this. I remember something like, that's not really the metric you should use, like whether or not you make the work. It's like, if you want to make the work, you should do it and you should figure out a way. But like, don't count on there being like, oh, I got this grant for this thing, right? Like, or else I'm not going to do it. Like, you should pursue the work you want to do. And if, you know, make the work you want to make, and like figure out a way to make it. I guess for me, one thing I'll say is like, when I make work, I think more about books, because it's like a way that you can like distribute the work, right? A show is great, but it's so ephemeral, it's so fleeting, right? It happens and then it's down. And for me, like the book is just like a more effective way about like getting my work, whether it's like a monograph or like a smaller you know, just artist book that you make. Just to me, that's just like, that's how I think about when I'm not like thinking about the book when I'm making the work, but like at the end of the day, that's how I kind of imagine the work entering the world, I guess.
I've been really fortunate in that almost every, so right now I'm planning the Aperture Portfolio Prize show, and then I had a show, the show at Baxter last January, and prior to that I was in a show I think the summer after Yale. But I've been really fortunate in that most of my show opportunities have also come with some funding. And in addition to like, so there's funding, like Baxter Street Camera Club of New York is a great residency that anyone in New York City needs to know about. As a resident, you get a $3,000 stipend. And then when it's time for you to have your show, you also have a show in their space on Baxter Street in Chinatown, Soho area. When it comes time to have your show, there's additional funding, like production funding. And so I've been really lucky with that stuff. I also teach, obviously, which, you know, is easier said than done. I'm well aware of how many adjunct opportunities there are, how little they pay. I've also been really lucky to teach full time the past couple of years, which has helped a lot. And then editorial work also. I've only done a handful of editorial things, but 1619 project was a really, really, really big project. And the timing of that was really convenient. I worked on it leading up to my show. And so, you know, that funding, that pay, that helped a lot. But it's tough. Like, I think what Eli is saying is really important about not necessarily counting on the money to be there. I also realized that that is easier said than done, but something that I say to my students a lot when they complain about being stuck on campus or like not having a staff or like a big budget is that like, well, what can you do today? Like, what can you do within your means? Like, it's not just about having all of those things. Like, if you have this crazy idea for a project where you travel the world because you want to map, I don't know, something, is there a way that you can scale that concept down and do it in a way that is within your means? Like, there definitely is. And once you do that and achieve that, then you start applying for grants and residencies and you start getting the funding, then you can scale up. But yeah, I think it's really important to learn how to work within your means and not let that stop you if possible.
There was a question here about how, like, kind of what you're working on now in light of what's going on with the pandemic. Has that made it particularly challenging for both of you as artists?
Yeah. Yeah, but not any more challenging than it is for anybody else to do anything else. Like, we're all in, yeah, it's like a tough time. So I don't know. I'm lucky to be able to still be an artist as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely. Sorry. It's definitely a challenge. Especially, it's like I had been working like with the community centers, right, and like people interacting, people touching, the value of being in a space with someone. But yeah, I totally agree with Danielle. It's like, it's still, I feel, you know, privileged and lucky, and you know, you figure out ways like, well, what can I do now, right? Take this limitation and use it as like a generative, you know, like push. Like, okay, well, I'm gonna like, what does it mean for me to make landscapes? Like, what does it mean for me to make portraits of my loved ones, people I can interact with, you know? So like using it, not necessarily as like, oh my God, I can't work, like my life is over, my career is over, and just like, well, I'm gonna do something different and we'll see how it goes, you know, a challenge, like a limitation.
Yeah. There's a good question here, I think, and maybe Eli, you can address this because you've worked on a monograph and are oriented towards bookmaking a little bit. From Ed Mausick, it looks like. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, but Yeah, just can you comment on sort of how you see the photo book making fitting into your career as an artist?
Is this from Ed Malchich?
Yes. Do you know this person?
Yeah, he's one of my students. Hey, Ed.
Ah.
Uh, how do I see photo books? I mean, I just love photo books. That's how I fell in love with photography. It was like going to the art library at Wesleyan, which no longer exists, but and looking at photo books, right? It's like photography has such a different relationship to books than like maybe sculpture or painting or installation, right? Where it's like you could go, and of course a duotone print is different than a silver gelatin print. But it's a lot closer. It's a lot closer, right? And a sculpture is to like a photograph of a sculpture. And so it's like that, again, it's like thinking about the community you want to be a part of, right? That's how I fell in love with it, right? I want to be part of that conversation. It's also just a way to like take your book around and show people like, this is what I'm doing, as opposed to carrying like a gigantic portfolio box, right? Or sending it, right? Mailing it to someone in China, right? Or in Paris or something. Like, it's, I don't know, for me, it's like a very effective way of putting the work out into the world. I think one thing, right, unless you're showing it like, you know, Gagosian or Blue Chip Gallery, or, you know, you have this gallery supporting you, it's like, how do you get your work out into the world when it's largely self-motivated, right? And for me, the book is like a really exciting way of doing that. And I guess I kind of imagine myself in this like community of people making books or something.
Yeah. This is a good question from Stephen Goldstein, and I think we've been touching on some of this stuff, but maybe Danielle, you can start with this. Just what do you believe are some of the essential early steps for an emerging fine art photographer? Just sort of a suggestion, you know, is it about the personal work that you're making, or you know, getting in touch with the photographers you admire and getting critiques? Like, what do you think are kind of some of those essential early steps?
Oh, it's a hard question because I feel like it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Like especially there's so many variables, like your background, what you want. For me, yeah, I guess like I guess recommitting myself to my practice after taking a little time off was my essential first step. That was like kind of all I needed to do to set me on my way. But yeah, I mean, I think a very important thing is finding a group of people, because that's what grad school really was. It was like a group of people who would push me and encourage me, who I could get feedback from and critique. So if you can find people that can do that for you, and maybe even a kind of mentor, I think that would be really helpful. But I also think it's important to immerse yourself in the conversation. Like, I love looking at art. I love art. I love photography. That's why I'm doing this. And so I'm looking at like art, you know, from, you know, the past, art that's being made right now, all the time, every day. And in doing that, I think I also, you know, I'm sort of understanding like what the conversation is about and what people are thinking about. And it's a way of expanding what I'm thinking about, but it's also a way of understanding, I guess, what's in the ether. And I think having that knowledge of what is around and like whose ideas align with yours and how they express those ideas, I think that's really important too.
Great, thank you. Eli, do you have any thoughts on kind of early sort of essential steps that you made as a fine art photographer?
Early post grad, or like just early, I guess I'm trying to figure out what early
Yeah,
is.
I mean, I think post grad, because I think post grad you start to actually, you know, you maybe are concentrating less on you know, making the work and more about, okay, well, what do I do with it now?
Yeah, I guess I'll go back to kind of the editorial thing where it's like I cold emailed a lot of people and I didn't hear from them for a while, right? And I think you know, in the 6-8 months, a year, right, I was doing retouching and printing, making my own work, struggling with that post grad feeling of like, who am I making this work for, right? No one sees this, so I don't have critique. And I think I freaked out a little bit, right, about like, oh my God, what am I going to do? But then, you know, slowly those things happen, and I think that there's like a certain amount of patience and just hard work. And, I think at first I was really like, I felt weird about like just emailing people out of the blue I didn't know. It's like, like, oh, I guess I felt like I was gonna be embarrassed or they weren't gonna like it. But it's like, who cares, right? It's like, do what you need to do to get your work out there, get your name out there, and let people see it, let photo editors see it, curators see it. And if they like it, they can reach out. So I guess just like patience, I think, is like really, really important, and just slowly, I'm not an expert like an Instagram or like any of that, but like that is like I think how a lot of photo editors and curators are interacting with work, especially in COVID, right, where people aren't going to physical spaces. So getting your work out there in some sense, I think is really, really good as well.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting close to the end of time here, so maybe we'll take a couple of questions. There was a really interesting question here from Kim Scott for Danielle. And she asked, Danielle, are you seeing a change in the reception of your work as a Black woman now, as opposed to before everything happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that?
Not really, but I am getting some, I'm just going to call it what it is, stupid requests to comment on how people can help, how photographers can help the Black community, or like how Black photographers can be helped by the photo community. And it's like not my job to tell people, to answer those questions for people. You can do the work yourself. Anyway.
Yeah. Right.
You know what? No, not really, because the people who I'm speaking to about my work are people that I was speaking to before. New people that I'm speaking to are more a result of the portfolio prize than anything else. Not because like people are in the sort of rush to Blackness or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and I'm sure that, I will not be spared from that nonsense. Like, but I have been lucky in like not really having to deal with too much of it.
That's good.
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a good question.
No, yeah. No, I understand that. Okay. Well, I think I'd maybe just wait another second here for questions from the audience, but I think that's it. Thank you both so much for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate it. It's so fascinating to hear not only about your work and what you're interested in as artists, but also how that kind of translates into the different opportunities that you create for yourselves. And it's like, I think, like you both touched on, there's no one size fits all approach to developing a career. So it's great to sort of hear about what's been helpful for you and what's been a factor in your early careers.